So we'll now work through an example of evaluating a complex argument. So here's the example argument I'm going to use. It's not an argument for or against the existence of God. It's an argument from Descartes, from the third meditation in his Meditations on First Philosophy. And at that point in the book, Descartes thinks he's already proved the existence of God. And so here he is wondering what the origin of his concept or idea of God could be. Where could it come from? And this is what he says. It only remains for me to examine how I got this idea, the idea of God. I did not derive it from the senses, since it did not at any time come to me unexpectedly, as normally happens with the ideas of sensible objects, when those objects affect, or seem to affect, the external sense organs. And it is not my own invention, for I can neither add anything to it, nor subtract anything from it. So it can only be innate in me. So here is the main conclusion of this argument. The main conclusion is that the concept of God is innate. So here's that argument in standard form. We have the main conclusion here, that the idea of God is innate in me. And that follows from two main premises, that the idea of God is not my own invention, and that I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. I've got the same structure shown here in this diagram. So here's the main conclusion, the idea of God is innate in me, and here are the two main premises. I didn't derive it from the senses, and it's not my own invention. Those two premises together are supposed to lead to the main conclusion. We also have some arguments for each of these two main premises. So the argument for the first premise, that I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses, is here. The idea of God didn't at any time come to me unexpectedly, and ideas of sensible objects sometimes present themselves to my external organs unexpectedly. Those two together are supposed to lead to this premise. I didn't derive it from the senses. And we also have an argument for this premise, that the idea of God is not my own invention. Why? Well, according to Descartes, because I can neither add nor subtract anything from it. When you're evaluating an argument like this, there are two options. You can either start with the main argument and begin by evaluating that. So you would ask the question whether these two premises are acceptable and whether they support the main conclusion. And then you would go on to evaluate the arguments for the premises. Alternatively, you can work from the bottom up and start by evaluating the arguments for the premises. So you'd start by evaluating this argument, and then maybe this one, and then finish by evaluating the main argument. Doesn't really make any difference which approach you use, bottom up or top down. In this example, I'm going to use the top down approach. So that means we start by evaluating the main argument, which has two premises. I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses, and the idea of God is not my own invention. Conclusion, the idea of God is innate in me. So, in evaluating any argument, remember there are two questions. Are the premises acceptable, and do they support the conclusion? I'll start by looking at this question. Supposing that premise 1 and premise 2 were true, would they give me a good reason to accept the conclusion? So the conclusion is that the idea of God is innate. Innate meaning, literally it means inborn. An innate idea is one that you are born with. What would it mean for that not to be true, for the idea of God not to be innate? To ask that question is to ask, in effect, what other sources of ideas are there? There are several you might think of. Some ideas we get from experience in one way or another. We learn them from experience. Some ideas we just invent or make up. Some ideas we get from other people, for example. So those are some different ways in which the conclusion could be false. Would be if we got the idea of God from, we learnt it from experience, or if we invented it, or we got it from other people. There may be some other possibilities here too. I'll leave you to think about that. And then we look at the premises and we note that they rule out two of those alternatives. If they're true, then they rule out the idea of God being learnt from experience and from it being invented. Notice though that they don't rule out this possibility, apparently, that we learnt the idea of God from other people. Descartes seems to ignore that possibility here. So at first glance it seems like the premises don't rule out all the different ways the conclusion could not be true, so that they don't support the conclusion. Perhaps things are not quite so straightforward, however. Perhaps learning from other people you can think of as a special case of learning from experience, so that really there are only these first two sources of ideas. And you might also ask, well, suppose I did learn the idea of God from other people, where did they get it from? They must either have got it from experience or by making it up themselves, or if they didn't and they learnt it from someone else, then that other person must have either got it from sense experience or by inventing it. Couldn't have an endless chain of people passing on this idea of God from one to the other. At some point it would have to have come from one of these two sources. So what shall we say then about this argument? We can say at least this, that so long as there are only three options, learning the idea from the senses, from experience, or inventing it and innate, as long as those are the only three possibilities, the only three sources of ideas, then this conclusion would certainly follow. If those are the only three possibilities, and it didn't come from the senses and wasn't my only invention, then the only other possibility is that it's innate. So if that assumption is right, given that assumption, we could say that premise 1 and premise 2 do support the conclusion, assuming that coming from the senses, being invented, and being innate are the only three possibilities. So far all we've done is evaluated the link between these two premises and the main conclusion. We've arrived at the evaluation that if these two premises were true, and if the assumption that I just mentioned was also true, then the main conclusion would also be true. But we haven't yet decided whether these two premises are actually true or acceptable. So we now move on to evaluating those premises. Descartes gives arguments for those premises, so we need to evaluate those arguments. We'll start with premise 1. Here's Descartes' argument for premise 1, the premise being I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. His argument is this: the idea of God didn't at any time come to me unexpectedly, and ideas of sensible objects sometimes present themselves to my external organs unexpectedly. So those are his two premises which support not the main conclusion, but this premise. I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. Still, we ask the two questions: are premise 3 and premise 4 acceptable as true, and do they support the conclusion? In this case, the conclusion being this. We'll start with the question of support again. Do these premises support the conclusion? Yes, I think they do. I think this is a deductively valid argument. Here is the argument slightly rephrased and with the premises in a different order. I've restated premise 4 like this. If an idea is derived from the senses, then it sometimes comes to you unexpectedly. But premise 3 says the idea of God never comes to me unexpectedly. Conclusion, the idea of God's not derived from the senses. What would it mean for this to be false, that the idea of God is not derived from the senses? Well, that it was derived from the senses. But if it was derived from the senses, then from P4, premise 4, it would follow that it sometimes comes to us unexpectedly. But premise 3 eliminates that possibility. It says it never comes to us unexpectedly. So if these two premises were accepted as true, we would have to accept this conclusion, that the idea of God is not derived from the senses. So P3 and P4 do support this conclusion, the premise that I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. But now we have to answer the different question whether premise 3 and premise 4 are acceptable. Premise 4 says, in my reformulation of it here, if an idea is derived from the senses, then it sometimes comes to us unexpectedly. Notice that's a general statement applying to all ideas derived from the senses, or all ideas learned from experience. So one way to evaluate it is to try to think of counterexamples. What would a counterexample be in this case? Well, it would be an idea that is derived from the senses, but never comes to us unexpectedly. Are there any ideas like that? Difficult to say, I think. It's maybe useful to start thinking about some examples of ideas that are derived from the senses. So let's consider, for instance, the idea of heat. That's an idea that we learn from experience, from sense experience, by being near to warm and hot things. Does it sometimes come to us unexpectedly? Well, yes, it does, I suppose. We can accidentally put our hand on something hot and burn ourselves. The nature of the world is like that it can constantly surprise us. So that seems to be an example that's consistent, at least, with Descartes' generalization here. That's an example of an idea that is derived from the senses, that does come to us unexpectedly. Is that a typical example? Are all ideas that are derived from the senses like that? Or are there some ideas derived from the senses that never come to us in an unexpected way? I'll leave you to think about that. I'm not sure what to say about it. I can't myself think of any good counterexamples. So what I will do for this example is just provisionally accept this claim. So I'm going to accept it provisionally, meaning I can't yet think of any reason to doubt it, so I'm going to grant it to Descartes. And I say, yeah, I accept that premise. And what about this other premise, premise 3? The idea of God did not at any time come to me unexpectedly. Well, Descartes has stated this whole argument in terms of what's true for him. The idea of God did not at any time come to me unexpectedly, he says. And his conclusion correspondingly is, I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. I suppose we have to take Descartes' word for it, that the idea of God didn't at any time come to him unexpectedly. If we take his word for it, then we accept the premise. So far then, this argument is looking quite good. We have at least provisionally accepted premise 4. We accepted it only provisionally because we couldn't think of any counterexamples, and looking at the one example that we considered, the example of heat, it seemed consistent with the premise. So we're going to accept that provisionally, meaning that we reserve our right to change our mind later on if we can come up with a counterexample or an argument against it. We also accepted premise 3, taking Descartes' word for it that the idea of God didn't at any time come to him unexpectedly. And we said that this argument was deductively valid. So we're going to at least provisionally accept premise 1, that I didn't derive the idea of God from the senses. We're only provisionally accepting it because we only provisionally accepted this premise 4. We've also seen that in the main argument, if premise 1 and premise 2 were both true, then the conclusion would follow, assuming that there were only 3 options. The idea is innate, the idea is my own invention, and the idea was derived from the senses. If those are the only 3 options, and I didn't derive it from the senses, and it's not my own invention, it would follow that the idea must be innate. But we are yet to evaluate this premise 2. Is it really true that the idea of God is not my own invention? So we now go on to evaluate that premise. So here's Descartes' argument for that premise. It just has one premise supporting it. Premise 5, I can neither add nor subtract anything from the idea of God. It's supposed to follow from that the idea of God is not my own invention. So, as usual, 2 questions. Is the premise acceptable? And does it support P2? So, does P5 support P2? Well, assuming something like this, we can say that it does. If this was true, then the conclusion P2 would follow from P5. If an idea is my own invention, then I can always add to it or subtract from it. Assuming that's true, and then it would follow from the fact that I can't add or subtract anything from the idea of God, that the idea of God can't be my own invention. But is this generalization true? It seems plausible if the concept or idea is really one that I've invented. Then it's up to me to create that concept or idea however I like. If the idea is my own invention, then it's up to me what goes into it and what doesn't go into it. So, on that assumption, which seems initially plausible, we can say that premise 5 does support premise 2. Only if we make this assumption. Of course, by itself it doesn't support the conclusion, but with this perhaps reasonable assumption, it does. Next question, is premise 5 acceptable? I can neither add nor subtract anything from the idea of God. Well, that doesn't seem acceptable to me. I have an idea of God, and this is essentially Descartes' concept of God too, as an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly benevolent being who created the universe. But can't I subtract some of those attributes from the idea? Then I'd get an idea of a God who is, for example, all-powerful and all-knowing, but not perfectly benevolent and not the creator. Why can't I subtract C and D, for example, or perhaps subtract something else from this concept of God? Maybe I could add things to the idea too. It's not at all clear why I can't do that, so that casts some doubt on this premise. On the other hand, it's useful, I think, to consider what Descartes would say in response to that. Here's what I think he might say. He might say, no, you can't really subtract any of these attributes from the concept of God, because if you do that, then it's not the concept of God anymore. It's not the idea of God anymore. Which is a way of saying that all of these components, all of these attributes are part of the definition or meaning of the term God. So you can't subtract any of them without destroying the idea. I suspect that's what he might say. That is somewhat controversial, though. These attributes of God are independent of each other, so logically speaking it seems like you certainly could remove the idea that God created the universe from this list without contradicting yourself. It's open to argument, but for now I'm going to say no, I'm not going to accept this premise, because it seems to me that I can at least subtract things from the idea of God. So let's summarise all of this. What I want to say now essentially about this argument is this. The argument's not successful because this key premise, that the idea of God is not my own invention, is not acceptable, or at least Descartes hasn't done enough to convince us of it in this argument. He's argued for it on the basis that you can't add anything or subtract anything from it, but it's not clear that that's true, so we don't have any more a good argument for this premise. The rest of the argument seemed okay, assuming that being invented or being derived from the senses or being innate are the only possibilities, then provided premise 1 and premise 2 were true, the conclusion would follow, and we accepted premise 1, at least provisionally, that the idea of God isn't derived from the senses. So if it really was the case that it wasn't my own invention, then it would have to be innate. But we haven't really got a good argument for the claim that it's not my own invention. So the argument isn't successful. Let me just add that the fact that we haven't got a good argument for this premise, of course, doesn't mean that it's false. It might be true. I'm not claiming that it's false. I'm just saying this argument isn't sufficient to establish it. Those, anyway, are my first thoughts on this very interesting argument of Descartes. It's worth thinking more about the potential response I mentioned to this part of the argument when I said Descartes might respond to my counterexample by saying, no, you can't really subtract any of those properties from the concept of God without changing the subject, without talking about something else. Those are all essential parts of the meaning of God. So Descartes is thinking of the idea of God in a way as though it was a kind of mathematical idea, because you can say the same thing about some mathematical ideas anyway. For example, consider the concept of an even number. An even number is one that's exactly divisible by 2. That's my concept of an even number. Can I add anything to it or subtract anything from it? It seems that I can't without changing the subject. If I added or subtracted anything from that definition, I wouldn't be talking about even numbers anymore. I'd be operating with a different concept. So if Descartes' argument is right, it would follow that concepts like even number are human inventions. And also, arguably, they're not derived from sense experience either, at least not obviously. So if Descartes' argument about God here was right, then apparently an analogous argument would show that mathematical ideas must be innate too. Thinking about an analogous argument like that can sometimes help you think about problems or issues with the original argument. If you don't want to accept that conclusion, that mathematical ideas like prime number, even number, odd number, triangle, if you don't want to accept the conclusion that those ideas are innate, where would the argument go wrong? They're not derived from the senses. They're not my own invention because I can't subtract or add anything to them without changing the subject. So therefore they must be innate. Something worth thinking about. You can see how this process of argument evaluation can quickly lead to some quite deep philosophical issues. which is why philosophers love to spend their time thinking very deeply about arguments.